right, everybody. Well, thank you for joining us for another episode of From the Ground Up. I am Megan Haupert, a board-certified behavior analyst, and I am joined by awesome autism dad, Mr. Scott Gaulden. Scott, how are you doing tonight?
Megan, I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I am great. How was your Super Bowl?
Super Bowl was great. We actually just got back from 3 days at Disney World. And let me tell you, I've got a 21-year-old autistic son that loves Disney World. He did really well. We had a great experience, and a little shout out to my friends down there in Orlando. They really do know how to run a good show, and they were very accommodating for families with special needs kids. So Disney does it great. And that mouse knows how to get your cheese, if you know what I mean. That mouse knows how to get your cheese. Be careful. Maybe it's a good thing we're going to talk about financial planning tonight, because I pretty much just blew anything that we had at Disney World. But if you're joining us, this is going to be a little bit of a different podcast. Normally, we talk a lot about autism therapy, insurance, all those things that are the day-to-day of today in an autistic family. We're going to talk a little bit about how to plan for the future, because we think it's never too soon to start that planning process. And I think if you're an autism parent, every autism parent out there, their dream is that my child is going to be able to live independently. And if your child is on that track, I'm thankful for you, and I hope that continues to work. But I also want to be realistic. Not every special needs child is going to be able to live independently, and it's going to require some support from family as well as ourselves. And the sooner we start kind of planning for that process, I think the better. What do you think, Megan?
Absolutely. And I think if we can provide families tonight with some guidance and some things to kind of think about. I know there's moms out there not sleeping at night, staring at the ceiling and just worried about their child's future. And if we can help provide some guidance and support and some knowledge of how to kind of navigate that in the future, hopefully we can help point them in the right direction for sure.
My smoking hot wife, Julie, once said that what's different about a special needs parent, most parents hope they never outlive their children, right? We want to be gone long before our children. Right. Special needs parents' dream is to live one day longer than our children. Just so that we know that they're taken care of through the rest of their lives. Chances are that's not going to take place. We're going to need to make plans for when we're gone. So tonight we have a special guest that's going to be joining us that is a financial planner. And Jeff is a very good friend of mine, known him for several years. And I know that he has experience with special needs families and doing the hard work of setting things up so that your family is prepared for this point. And we'll introduce him in just a second, because I did want to make one other point. Because we are a show that talks about family, and I think that it's critical that early on you talk with your family members about what's going to happen when you're gone. I'll give you one example. In the case of both of my son-in-laws, they both came to me to ask my daughter for their hands in marriage. And I said, okay, it's fine to ask that, but we're going to have a conversation now. Okay. You've got a little bit of a test to pass. And in both cases during that conversation, I had some real questions to ask about. Along with my daughter, you have to understand comes a role that you have to be willing to play in the future of my son. And in both cases, both son-in-laws jumped up and said, look, I've already thought about that. I want Colby to be a part of our life. And so it just became really aware to me that we have to start those conversations early. So if you've got a small child that has siblings, you've got to start talking to those siblings. Hey, this is something that you're going to be prepared for. These are some things that I need to train you how to do. And this is your brother or your sister. You need to be prepared. I'm going to try to make the burden as light as possible, but there's going to be a day where you've got to start that. And it's good that we start that discussion now.
Absolutely.
So, with that being said, let's bring on Jeff.
Yes.
Jeff, welcome to our program. Glad to have you.
Having me.
Yeah, thank you. And Megan, I haven't told you this about Jeff, but he and I are one of a kind when it comes to music. There are very few people that have the same musical taste that I have. And I'm thankful that Jeff is one of those people that has musical taste. A big Chicago, Chicago, Earth, Wind and Fire, Tower of Power. What's that?
And I said, I don't mean the Longhorns.
No, it's got to have saxophones and trumpets and trombones, and it better have a funky sound to it, right?
Absolutely.
So, I've known Jeff for about 7 years. He's part of a networking group that I'm a part of, and Jeff is a certified financial planner. Jeff, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I've done a few things over my life, but I've been in this world for over 20 years now, worked with individuals and families. And Scott kind of knows the story and background. I won't take the time to go into all of that now, but the mentor, the reason I do this, built a business and a life serving his clients and his community, not because he had to, because he wanted to, because his family already had plenty of money. But the concept of supporting those around him is something that I took from him from day one into this business. And that's what my goal is every day, is to take those clients, start walking down that path, building that foundation one brick at a time. How do we get to that vision of legacy? And I know we were talking about this earlier, and Scott knows I talk about it all the time. But we all leave a legacy behind, and it's either defined or it's by default. And defined is a heck of a lot better than by default.
Wow, what a great statement. And I think it's important that we spend time thinking about that and making those plans of how do we want to be remembered? What kind of impact do we want to have on our family? And so what I love about Jeff is he's not just dollars and cents. He's talking about what values do you want to leave behind? What kind of thinking and principles do you want to leave behind? And what kind of encouragement do you want to leave behind? It has to be more than dollars and cents, doesn't it, Jeff?
It does. It has to be more than dollars and cents. I mean, obviously we live in a world, right? Money makes it go round, but right, that legacy is everything we bring to the table beyond that money. And from a family standpoint, and especially a family with kids with autism and other issues, right? It's all, the world revolves around them. You love all your family members, but the world revolves around them. And you're going to have to set something special in place because you want something special for them if and when you're not here. Because no matter what we may want, the reality is we're probably not going to be here for them one day.
Now, let me stop for just a moment and let every listener know this. Everybody has a different financial situation. Absolutely. You may be going through a tough time right now. It may be doing good just to get the bills paid right now. And you think to yourself, how do I even begin to think 20, 30 years ahead? And all I'm going to tell you is tonight's program, we're going to talk about taking baby steps. You can't accomplish these things in one giant step. You're not going to wake up one morning with all the problems solved. And if you're sitting there going, I can't stand to think about another minute about finances, just bear with us. We're going to try to make this at least seem a little bit easier. We're going to try to take some of the complication out of it and just kind of paint a picture for where you maybe want to start heading. But please understand, we're not here to make you feel any more anxiety over your financial situation than you already might feel. Okay. We're going to try to hopefully make you feel more secure about this and that instead of less secure about this.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Scott. And that's from our end, right, where we approach everybody and folks that we refer people to, right. From the get-go. Not everyone is in the same spot. And what somebody that's starting quarterback in the NFL needs to do for, right, a special needs child is a lot easier, right? And that doesn't make the world fair. It's just a fact. It makes it a lot easier for them than someone else who's struggling as a family. And God forbid, it's a single parent with a special needs kid. It's tough.
Yes.
And it's one bite of the apple at a time. That's what we got to do.
So, Jeff, let's start out with just kind of if you were to sit down with a family tonight that is in the beginning stages of saying, hey, here's some of the first things I think I need to do, or here's some of the conversations we need to start. What would be maybe the one or two of the first steps you might suggest to somebody?
Yeah, it starts with that vision, right? With family. And what have you done discussing with family? What is your plan, and what happens when that plan doesn't work, right? My sister, right? They're very involved. They live in the same town. They live down the street. They interact with us all the time. And my sister will take over if we're not here next week. And that's an easy answer, but the reality is we find quite often that conversation with the sister has never actually even happened, right?
Yes.
It was assumed. And the sister, right, may be in a position where that's great and I'd love to help, but so we need to work through that, right? What's the plan? What's the backup plan? What would you like? Now, how do we start to put those pieces in place? And you said, Scott, you just got back from Mickey land, right? Life is expensive. So how do we start to eat one bite at a time? Because we can't, right? There's just too much to be done. There's too much cost-wise, there's too much time-wise to be done. So how do we start with this little baby step?
My guess would be, Jeff, that people avoid that conversation of even beginning to talk to somebody about, would you be willing to keep my child if something happened to me? And the thing that I want to express to people is, if you don't have that conversation, the state gets to decide. And that's not a decision you want to have. Okay. So I want to really encourage you. The first question you should be answering right now is, let me have a conversation with a family member that I think is capable of doing this. And God forbid it happens. We hope it doesn't.
Honestly, just not even just one, right? What's the right?
And backup. You need a number two too, right?
You need a number two. Because unfortunately those things happen. That's exactly where it starts. And I think some estate planning 101 is important here, just in some normal speak, so people have a conversational awareness of what that means. But then how do we start to fill those pieces in? And family and money play a huge part of that, because there is nothing more stressful for most people to talk about than money.
Yes.
And that becomes a big concern when that sister down the street, and we'll just stay with that theme because it's easy, that sister down the street may be more than happy to help. They may be the person to step in. Their hesitancy, their concern is, how much is this going to cost me? Can I afford to continue to take care of my own family? What else is going to be impacted? Am I going to be able to do what I need to do to provide for this child? Now that becomes another dependent part of my life. And there's ways, as we start working through clients, how do we make sure that doesn't happen?
And my thought, Jeff, and again, I'm not the financial advisor, but it seems to me like one of the first steps is to get in place some type of an insurance program before you do anything else. Even if you don't have a lot of money, especially if you're young and you're insurable, insurance is a very inexpensive way. A life insurance policy is a very inexpensive way to fund that situation. For $50 a month, $100 a month, you can fund a very comprehensive life insurance policy. Should something happen to you or your spouse, that would set aside funds for that particular.
No, you're exactly right. And that is step number one, because the cheapest and easiest way to fund, if you're not here, right, to fund an account, whether it's a special needs trust or otherwise, is that life insurance policy. Is tax-free proceeds. It's right. And it's easy to obtain out there. So you're exactly right. People who are young, it's not that expensive to get a 10, a 15, a 20-year term policy. We talk through that with young parents who are starting off that don't have special needs, right? Because cash flow just isn't as much as when we're later in our lives.
Right.
So it works for everybody, but certainly in this case, when you can go to your sister down the street and say, oh, by the way, if we do get hit by a bus 6 months from now, there's a $500,000 life insurance policy that's going to fund an account that's going to allow you to help continue to take care of our child. That's a whole different conversation for that sister now.
Yes.
And you're right. For depending on age, health, all of those conditions, right? But for a reasonable amount of money, they can create that pool of funds down the road. Is that the answer to every question? Term insurance? Absolutely, it's not.
Right.
But it's the cheapest, easiest way to get started.
And what I would suggest, would you suggest that that's probably the first conversation you want to have on that financial planning is, if somebody's out there going, look, I can't take big steps right now. That's a baby step that can at least relieve some of the worry in the back of your mind. That's an easy step that you could take for a couple of bucks a month.
Absolutely.
Could
help.
No,
that I mean, when we're sitting down, we want to go through a whole process because the last thing we want to do is step that's already been covered or a step that doesn't fit because there's another factor, right? Hey, this is great, but what we didn't factor in is, a grandparent over here who's is about to leave a whole bunch of money.
Right.
So maybe we don't need the term insurance. Maybe we need to meet that client needs to meet that need somewhere else.
Right.
But that's also the good thing with term insurance, right? Is
Yeah.
you stop writing that monthly or that quarterly check, and the policy drops off. It's not like stopping a car payment. They don't come after you. They don't care.
They're not going to pay it anymore anyway, right?
Yeah. So term insurance is a great, effective place to start because it gives those other family members options.
Yeah.
And that's really what we want to create at the end of the day is tax efficient options, because money gives those folks the ability to make the best decision possible for that child.
Right. So let's talk about maybe they've got something like that in place. They've just got kind of a basic safety net. What would you think would be like the next 2 or 3 steps somebody might want to make, Jeff?
So after that can depend a little bit on an individual situation. Right. So let's back up from that just a little bit. And let's do, if you guys don't mind, let's do some estate planning 101. And I know we're kind of jumping steps here, but I think it sort of makes sense to what's that vision that we might want to get to down the road that we're taking these steps to get to, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So here's my version of estate planning 101, right? It is if you've done nothing and you get hit by a bus tomorrow, next week, next month, you die intestate, right? You die, and it's up to the state to decide what happens with your assets, your children, all of those things. And there's a plan. It's not random. A judge is involved. There's a process. And depending on the state in which you live, right, it's going to go to your spouse or your brother or your kids or your parents. And some states are a little bit different. But you die intestate, and it's subject to the rules of the state. If you create a will, and attorneys certainly can do wills, and those are the most, I will say, efficient or effective. You can write a will out on your own and just sign it and date it. It's better if you have somebody witness and sign it. It's even better if you get it notarized, and it's even better than that if you have an attorney do it. But a will, what I describe a will as, is like a Christmas list when we were kids, right? I mean, how many times, Scott, did you make a Christmas list? Megan, did you make a Christmas list when you were a kid and give it to mom and dad?
I just handed her the Sears catalog toy section. I want everything from pages 240 to 260, okay? That are boy toys.
Right? With that Christmas list, Megan, right? I mean, you gave it to mom and dad, and you hoped everything on that list came to pass, right? But it was up to somebody else whether it actually did happen or not. And guess what? If you had siblings, they might be lobbying.
They could change minds.
Need the Barbie dream house. Just the Barbie, right? She doesn't need anywhere to live. She can live in Megan's closet. That's a will. It's a Christmas list. Most of the time, you get everything that's on the list, but that's up to a judge, right? There's a process, and then beyond that is creating a trust. And there's a lot of pieces in a trust. They get very complicated, and we'll talk a little bit about special needs trusts. But that's a legal document. And so whatever is in that trust it's not the word of God, but it's the word of the judge in the court system. And so it's one visit, the judge approves that trust, and boom, these things happen. There's no questions. It's not open to interpretation. No family members can lobby, and there's a couple exceptions, but nobody can contest it, right? It just happens. And that's the cleanest and neatest, and honestly, the less stressful. Doesn't cost you any more money than doing it later. And I'm not an attorney. I don't get paid to do this. I don't write these. But the cost is honestly the same. The stress that you take off of those that you leave behind when there's a plan, when we know that my sister down the street is going to take over as guardian of my child, and that we've set up a third-party trustee to take care of the finances. And so there's no family argument now because my brother wants to be involved, even though he's not going to be guardian of the child, but he thinks he knows money. And so he starts putting his 2 cents in, and all of a sudden you've created stress in the family. When we separate that trustee role out from that guardian role, it makes a huge difference. And again, it's just another layer of stress that we can remove from what's already now a stressful situation.
Jeff, do those trusts, if we do a trust compared to a will, does it kind of help expedite the process and expedite all of those things a little bit more quickly than it just kind of sitting in for interpretation in a court? And
99% of the time, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Because again, that will is that Christmas list. It has to go through a process, and that's judges and that's court. A trust goes one time and they're pretty quick.
Okay.
So yeah, it absolutely expedites that. Now, That's a great question, because we always want to talk to people is make sure you have multiple buckets of money out there that you're planned for, especially initially, right? You're going to burn through somebody's going to burn through some of that money pretty quickly on the front end. But to your point, if you die intestate, if you die with a will, there's going to be a little bit of time for that to all get processed by the state and the court system. Meanwhile, you've got an autistic child here that needs special care, might need, right, whatever's going on at this point. The last thing you need is to figure out how, where, who's paying for it, who's in charge. That's all up in a will, but it hasn't been declared by a judge yet. So now who's doing it? And we've seen stories where bad things happen. Unfortunately, they're just caught in a poor situation. A trust minimizes that. Time-wise, a trust maximizes the value of having some extra buckets of money out there so they can stay in that care facility maybe that they've been part of. We've got friends and their daughter's been in a care facility in Arizona for 20 some years now. So when something happens to them and they're in their early 80s, when something happens to them, she'll go on living right where she's at that place, because the buckets of money are there. And then once the trust clears and the special needs trust kicks in, it will continue to pay those bills. But that month in between, and it may not be a month, that's covered because there's a bucket of money set aside to make sure that transition period isn't stressful.
And as somebody that's gone through that process, the thing that I can say is, as a trustee, you can write checks for expenses the day after the death. You've got authority to make payments and stuff like that. With a trust, with a will, you may have to go to court, and it may be a 60, 90-day process. And those funds could be potentially tied up where you can't, they're there, but you've got no access to them. You've got no ability to write from those buckets. So especially if somebody's lifestyle or living arrangement is dependent upon regular cash flow, you really want to look at having a trust in place just because of the speed at which somebody has access to those funds.
Absolutely.
And maybe we should go back to the idea of, can we define a trust? Because there may be somebody that's sitting out there going, trust is something that I hear people talk about, but I've got no idea what it is. Right. Can we kind of maybe define that just a little bit, Jeff, so that help people to understand how it works?
Sure. A trust, at the end of the day, right? A trust is it's a legal document, right? That creates an order, a process of wishes upon your passing. What most people think of a living trust, right? This is protecting my money while I'm alive, and it determines what kids it goes to, doesn't go to, pass the house on. We've seen the drama on TV, and the reality is most trusts aren't designed to deal with that. That's TV drama, but it causes people not to go out and they think a trust is not for them, and it is, right? And so that legal document is going to define what happens. And when we go, in this case, for special needs families, we're creating a trust, we're creating an entity that has its own tax ID number, right? As people, we all have social security numbers. Those are our tax ID numbers, right? And we all know them by heart. When we create a trust, a special needs trust, right, it has its own tax ID number. It's its own entity. And there's some benefits that come with that, some benefits tax-wise, and there's some benefits income-wise, potentially for those guardian and trustees dealing with that child going forward. So,
okay, and people are going to hear the idea of a special needs trust. I know we've got the definition up there, because for those that have special needs children, a special needs trust is something that's even more defined than that, right? So maybe we can define that real quick, Jeff. How do you define a special needs trust?
Yeah, so in a special needs trust, what we're doing is setting up that entity and then making sure there's a pool of money available for that child, because now you've got a decision to make as a parent, right? Again, my example earlier, if you're a starting NFL quarterback with several $100 million in the bank, they're going to do something different than what most of us normal people are going to do out there, right? At some point, there are state and federal benefits and programs that are going to help that special needs child, help with some of their cost and some of their care. And a special needs trust, because of its unique setup, allows us to have a bucket of money available, hopefully for the lifetime of that special needs child, And it doesn't have to be depleted immediately, because if you are using SSI, Social Security income, if you're on Medicare, Medicaid, in that case, all your assets have to be liquidated. There's a test. And if you have available assets, those are going to be liquidated down to about $2,000 before that other state and federal assistance kicks in. And $2,000 is not a lot of money.
Right.
So they want to bankrupt you, which is kind of a harsh term, but they want to bankrupt that, right? And so by creating the special needs trust, we've created a taxable or a non-taxable entity to hold those assets for the benefit of that special needs child that does not disrupt the income and benefits from some of those state and federal programs when done properly.
If you don't mind, let me paint a picture for you as a parent. If you were to pass away and you left it doesn't even have to be a sizable amount. Let's say a reasonable amount of money to try to help your special needs child over the rest of their life. If you don't have a special needs trust, the first thing that the government is going to see you do is spend all those dollars before any government benefits can take place. They're going to see you spend all those dollars down to $2,000, and then they'll start picking up the tab. Well, now what you've done is, like Jeff has said, is you've basically put your child into bankruptcy, and then you've given them the ability to live just above the poverty level by the government. And that's what you want to avoid, right? That's every parent's worst nightmare. So the special needs trust allows all those funds to just sit out there, and they can't be spent. It's not like if you've got other kids, they can have access to that and go for a party. Those funds have to be spent on behalf of that child, but it allows funds to be there so that additional clothing can be purchased, additional therapies can be purchased, maybe even additional living arrangements can be, adaptations can be made, etc. Those dollars will always be there until they're spent down. But if you don't have this in place, all that's going to be spent before any of the government monies can kick in. So to me, this is maybe the third or fourth step in financial planning for a special needs family, but it is critical. If you don't have this in place, if you've got, I'm going to say anything more than $50,000 that could go to that child. If you've got anything more than that and you don't have a special needs trust set up, you're setting up that child for failure. You're setting up a bad situation, right, Jeff?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's a couple exceptions to that, but that is the standard, right? Get out there and get that trust set up. And I would say two things to that. When we get into the special needs trust, there are self or first party special needs, and there's third party special needs trust. And there's a big and important difference, because when you look at it, they kind of sound like they're funded the same, right? They come from parents or grandparents or whatever, and it can come from both. In part, it's a matter of, is it a gift or not? And two, when does it happen? Those are important. A first party trust is something that became an asset, right? That if something you had, Scott, became an asset of your son's, and then you try and put it in a trust, well, that's first party trust because it was his first before it went into the trust.
Right.
If you have a life insurance policy, Scott, and I want you at the meeting on Fridays, but so hopefully we see you then. But if you get hit by a bus between now and then, that life insurance policy, those proceeds can go into that special needs trust, and that trust is going to be a third party special needs trust. And the big difference here is, at the end of life, assuming that the trust did its thing and kept those assets separated, and the state and federal programs helped, if there's still assets in that first party trust upon passing, the state will come back for reimbursement for money out of their pocket. If it's a third party special needs trust, there's no coming back for that, right? Yes. It's a different deal. So we want assets, we want planning on the front end going into that third party trust, which goes back to the planning piece, right? Why do we start now? So we can get to a point where there's buckets of money, so we can create that special needs trust ahead of time, so that hopefully that's a long ways down the road and we have the time to start getting all those pieces of foundation built. Started with that term policy for the new single parent who's trying to get by. Just get that term policy and have some protection for your child. If you're not here next week, down the road, you have more time, you have more assets. We get this trust, we get these things created so that you give that child and the family surrounding them the best possible chance at success and happiness.
And let's talk about once the special needs trust is set up, Jeff, then you want to have the beneficiary of that life insurance policy be the special needs trust, right? So that the funds go directly into that trust. That's the way ours is set up. If something were to happen to me tomorrow, well, first off, it would go, the funds would go into our family trust so that Julie would have that. But then immediately upon the death of the last of us, my wife and I, all of those funds transfer straight over to Colby's special needs trust, so that it just flows right in there. And so the funds are available so that our other children have the funds to help take care of him for whatever period of time that would be.
That's great. So let me back up for just one second, sure. Because there are, besides doing that, right, not everyone has the money to go out and spend to get that trust done, right? And they don't have the time and the assets yet necessarily to start funding that in a big manner. So another option, and this fits with special needs trust, but another option that can feed into that is there's some annuity options out there as well that people can use and fund that have tax credit or tax control growth on them, have income restrictions, and have creditor restrictions that, if done properly, won't count against the state and federal programs. Without going to the expense and time of doing. Ultimately, hopefully, that's where everybody ends up with the special need trust and the ability and capacity to fund that. But if not, using some of these annuity products, and there's a disability annuity trust and there's disability annuity special needs trust, and there's a slight difference in there. It has to do with taxes and control. That disability special needs trust is very much like a trust light. There's a good descriptor for it.
Okay.
It's trust light. And there's no cost, right? You're not doing legal work. There's some legal, because it's an insurance product, there are legal requirements and ties that go with it, like beneficiaries are beneficiaries. Hey, this is going to pay lifetime income now for my child. Right? The creditors, the agencies can't count that money, that corpus of money in the account against them, right? They can't liquidate it down to $2,000. It just continues to provide income over a lifetime for that child. There's a couple tricky pieces to work in there, but there's another option.
Wow, that's something I wasn't even aware of. And it seems to me like that's a great middle step in the process. Start with the life insurance policy, maybe then move to this annuity type product. And then when you're later in life, and when I say later comes sooner than you think, but when you have the resources that are necessary to take the step to the special needs trust, and maybe you can do that. Yep. So it's a process throughout, right?
Yep. It's a perfect middle step. And honestly, it can stay involved in the long run too, depending on what they are. And I will, without going into a whole annuity descriptor here, just say for those of you out there, if when I say the word annuity, you go and tighten up because you've heard bad things about them. First of all, a lot of those are true. There's some bad things out there with annuities, but there's a lot of great things as well, right? And it's like everything else in life. Everything has a time, place, and a purpose. And those annuity contracts do have a time, place, and purpose, and there's several versions of them. And so I know from our end, we want to find the right fit for the client. What can you afford to do? What's going to give you the most benefit that you can do right now? And the flexibility to change it down the road. Right? We've got some of those that you're not in. The old world, people think you're locked into an annuity contract until you die. And that's not true in the new world, where you can build assets. And right, we get to a point in life where that annuity doesn't make sense. We want to do a different form with the special needs trust. We can pull the money out and it can roll into that special needs trust. Right? And we've in essence done away with all the quote bad things of annuities. So there's some real flexibility out there for folks that are trying to figure out how to start to make this happen.
How about like 401ks and IRAs, Jeff? I mean, those are real popular products and easy to work with now. How could those funds maybe help in this funding the special needs child over time?
Sure. So those proceeds can go over as well. There is a little bit of a trick in planning now because you do run into retirement distributions. Mm-hmm. We also run into the new laws that are kicking in last year and this year on mandatory distribution So the government's forcing us to liquidate those in a quicker manner than normally in the past for a non-spouse. And of course, with the special needs child, that's a non-spouse. Now, it looks like there's probably going to be some exemptions for special needs disability, like in the rest of the world, but we don't have a lot of clarification on that yet. I'm not sure how much has really been tested, at least that we've seen yet. Hopefully it will be allowed to continue as an exception. But like anything else, those assets are out there. Now, they can roll into a special needs trust, but it becomes a math problem. And that's something we would, from our end, we want to work through with every person individually, because what other assets are out there? Does it make sense to just let it cash out, pay the taxes on it, and fund some things because they just need to happen and they've been built up? Or does it make sense to find a way to roll that over and get creative? And from our end, if we've got a client that has 2 or 3 children, one special needs and one or more that are not, right? We're going to start accounting for that in assets. And where does 401k IRA money that comes with a couple extra rules, that's probably going to get distributed to the other children because they have more flexibility and options. And we're going to divert more specialized and targeted money towards that special needs trust in an ideal world.
Yeah. Well, let me ask this, Jeff. What, in terms of like final things that you'd want to tell a special needs family, what would be the final couple of things that you'd want to make, big picture points that you'd want to make?
Start with life insurance.
Yep.
Because you can't beat it for the money. Conversations with your family and friends, but you need another conversation. You really need to sit down with a good estate lawyer, a good accountant CPA, a good financial advisor. You need to include, depending on what else may or may not be going on with your child, include a doctor in that conversation. And then who do you think is going to be the trustee and the guardian? Get them involved in that conversation as well, because the earlier that everybody is talking, and you alluded to this earlier, Scott, the earlier everyone is talking, the much smoother this process is going to go. And don't jump to decisions. Take your time. Nothing, unless you're pending a poor health diagnosis that's going to take you out in the next week, nothing has to be decided today. Take a week, think about it, talk through it with other people that you know that have lived through this in support groups. Jump on a podcast you might find online.
Just randomly, here we go.
Take your time to do that, because rush decisions aren't always the best decisions. And Scott, you and I talked about this a week or so ago. Thanks to trusts, thanks to the lawyers, there are a lot of things that we can do to help benefit these kids. At a point, we put so many layers of armor in place that the car can't move anywhere, and we're kind of stuck. And what I told Scott was, I've got some clients and their kids were young, and they set a trust up in place, assuming where they thought their kids might be at a later point in life. And now, as it turns out, their kids are going to be productive or members of society out there with jobs and working and living independently. And they're going to need some help, but they're not going to need as much help as mom and dad thought. Mm-hmm. And the work that was done is having to be unraveled a little bit because there were a couple too many restrictions put in place. And honestly, it's been a problem for the mom. It's limited the mother for the last year. Now, it looks like we're about a month from getting that fixed and rescinded. So not everything is always permanent. If it's an irrevocable trust, it's flat done. Fortunately, this was not an irrevocable trust. So just a problem of multiple trustees, guardians, and people involved. So stay flexible, right? And everything, stay flexible. Stay flexible.
Yeah. Jeff, if somebody was interested in talking with you about maybe doing a financial plan, what would be a good way for them to get a hold of you?
Our office phone number, 817-714-0654. Certainly can reach out to the office. And then my email at work, j.swearingen, you can see it on the screen there, j.swearingen @lpl.com. Comes right to us, and somebody from the office will reach back out and get a hold of you. We're on the website, we're on Facebook and those things as well, but just pick up the phone and call our office. Technology is wonderful, podcasts are great, but
it's still about relationships, isn't it,
It's
Jeff?
still about relationships.
It's still about relationships.
Somebody.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I'd like to close with a quick reminder. If you're searching for a church home and you have a special needs child in the Fort Worth, Tarrant County area, we'd love to have you come try us out at the Hills Church. If you want to contact me, I'd be happy to put you in contact with the ministers of our special needs ministry for those. We've got like a respite nights coming up and marriage classes and things like that. We just love to have you to be a part of that. If you're somebody that's searching for a church home. Megan, do you want to give how they can get in contact with you in case they've got some other questions?
Absolutely. You guys can reach out to me on social media at Haupert Consulting LLC. I can be found on Facebook, on Instagram. You can check out my website as well, haupertconsulting.com, or shoot me an email at haupertconsultingllc@gmail.com. So when in doubt, search Haupert Consulting and you will find me in one of multiple ways. So
great. Jeff, thanks again for joining us. It's been a great conversation.
Megan, Scott, appreciate you guys having me. This has been great.
And for everybody else, we'll see you next time.
bye, guys.
Have a great night.